I'm a big fan of legacy support in Yu-Gi-Oh! When it actually does what it's supposed to do. I think of a card like Blaze Accelerator Reload, which is a card that enhanced an older archetype, one that was basically never played in anything, and actually made it a competitively viable rogue strategy, and I think that that sort of legacy support is awesome. However, I don't like the legacy support that doesn't help the strategy and ends up making it just as good as it was before the support came out, because if it's not enhancing the strategy, well, what was the point of releasing it in the first place? And I think that's basically what happened with the Cyberdark support. Now, this isn't so new anymore, it's been about a year, but the reason that we're looking at it today is because it is hard to tell when support first comes out, when a new pack first comes out, if people really don't like the deck, if the deck actually is good. All these sorts of opinions are way up in the air when the set first drops, because pretty much no matter how bad a deck is, when a new support for a deck drops, people are going to experiment with it. I myself experimented with these Cyberdark cards. I played them on several live streams and actually made a couple videos on them as well. But in today's video, we're going to talk about why these cards failed so horribly. And we now know that we're like almost a year past these cards being released, that these basically saw no competitive play, even as a rogue deck, which I think goes to show that these cards did in fact fail. We're not guessing if these cards failed, we know they failed, we're just going to look at why. So first off, if you don't know what the Cyberdarks do, that's no problem at all. Basically what you need to know is that there's 3 level 4 Dark Machine monsters, and they all have this same normal summon effect that lets them equip a level 3 or lower dragon monster to them, and they gain their attack. That's pretty much all you need to know. They do have sort of these bonus on the field effects. Those ones don't really matter too much. These cards basically saw no play. They were sort of the main reason that I think a lot of people remember Cyberdark Impact as one of the worst sets of all time, just because they had these Cyberdark monsters that were so terrible even for when they came out. The cards didn't see any play, and this was Konami's attempt at modernizing them. So I'm talking about these today because they do something with these Cyberdark cards, well, the field spell in particular, that I've been noticing that they've been doing for a couple cards. So let's take a look at it and talk about why this doesn't work when we're talking about fixing legacy archetypes. So Cyberdark Inferno, this card is pretty cool. So the first couple lines of text here basically say that your Cyberdark effect monsters you control that are equipped with an equip card. So that's what they all do when they are summoned. They can't be destroyed by an opponent's card effect, and also they can't be targeted. That's pretty cool. I don't know if it's enough though. We'll talk about that in a second. But it basically makes them like Cosmos spaceships. They can't be targeted, and even though the Cosmos spaceships could be destroyed, these ones now can't. So these actually have more protection when they have an equipped spell than a Cosmos spaceship. That's pretty cool. Also, it has sort of this Brilliant Fusion type effect. It's not quite Brilliant Fusion because you have to bounce a Cyberdark monster you control, but that's kind of what you can do. You can reuse their effects that way. You can bounce it back to hand, summon them again, and then get another equip. That's kind of neat. That's sort of the second effect there. And the last effect, if this card in its owner's control is destroyed by an opponent's card effect, you can add 1 polymerization spell or fusion spell card from your deck to your hand. And that last effect would have been a lot better if it let you destroy it with your card effects, but as it stands, it's pretty good. A lot of times your opponent is going to want to get this off the board as soon as possible so they can actually destroy your Cyberdark monsters or target them, and that means that you'll at least get something for that exchange. You'll get to add a card to your hand. In a lot of cases, it's going to be Brilliant Fusion. That's one that I liked a lot in this deck for obvious reasons, but Brilliant Fusion just seemed to be pretty good, and there were plenty of other things that were experimented with, but that part's not super important. But on paper, this field spell is actually okay. It's not terrible, it's not amazing, it's okay. But one thing that really grinds my gears about this is that I don't like that Konami seems to be addressing a lot of legacy support by just giving them this sort of non-targeting, non-destruction prevention methods, and I don't think that works. Actually, we know it doesn't work. We can look at the BES support that came out not too much before that support came out. If they got a field spell here, it's called BEF Zelos, and this thing basically reads the exact same. So if you didn't notice, it says your opponent can't target your BES cards with card effects, and also they can't be destroyed by your opponent's card effects. That's the exact same thing that Cyberdark Inferno does, and just like with the Cyberdarks, the BES cards really didn't see, I mean, they even saw less experimentation than the Cyberdark cards, and that's because they just got this field spell, with the Cyberdarks got a couple other cards. But basically, what I think this goes to show is that when you look at cards like Cosmos, the reason that Cosmo Dark Destroyer is so darn good isn't only because it can't be targeted. that certainly matters, but the reason that Dark Destroyer and Cosmos as a whole were powerful was because they were easily special summonable, because they had destruction effects on their summon, and also they floated into other cards when you eventually did get them off the board. Now I will say that the non-targeting effect of Cosmo Dark Destroyer did make it a lot harder for your opponent to deal with, but if this card had only the prevention of targeting, this card would not have been as powerful, and I think that really does show that if you just tack that on to a field spell card as legacy support, that doesn't automatically make your archetype good, which I think is something that Konami hasn't quite realized yet, and that really is disappointing. So Cyberdark Inferno isn't a horrible card, but it doesn't do enough to actually support the Cyberdarks from a competitive standpoint. Now, what else did they get? Well, they also got some monsters. They got Cyberdark Cannon. This card is my favorite one, and what these new Cyberdark monsters aim to do is actually give good effects or reward the player for using these Cyberdark level 4 monsters to actually equip dragons. So Cyberdark Cannon is a level 3 dragon with 1600 attacks. That really does boost the Cyberdark monsters by a lot of attack points when you equip them. If this card ascends to the graveyard while equipped to a monster, you draw 1 card, so that's really cool. That's a non-once per turn effect. So if you somehow get multiples of these equipped to stuff and they all go to the grave, you get to draw a whole bunch of cards. That's really cool. And then also, you can use each of the following effects once per turn. So in the hand, you can discard Cannon to add a Cyberdark machine monster from deck to your hand. So it's not another copy of Cannon. It's not the other new card because they're both dragon level 3 monsters, but it is all of the original Cyberdarks. And then also, during damage calculation, if a monster equipped with this card battles, you can send 1 monster from your deck to the graveyard, so you sort of get that foolish burial effect going along. That's really cool as well. And along sort of the same style of cards, we have Cyberdark Claw. So when this card is sent to the graveyard while equipped to a monster, you can target 1 Cyberdark monster in your graveyard, add it back to your hand. So it's kind of like a monster reincarnation, obviously a little slower, but it does have that sort of recursion effect that Cyberdarks or any strategy really wants to have. And this one, when it's in your hand, you can discard it to add a Cyberdark spell or trap card from your hand. It's okay. It's not the best effect. You can add Cyberdark Inferno. You can even add Cyberdark Impact, which is the kind of Miracle Fusion type card for the Cyberdragon or Cyberdark archetype. And even though Cyberdark Impact isn't the most powerful card, just because it requires a bit of setup, having the option to search it with Cyberdark Claw is pretty neat. And then also, this is really cool. So during damage calculation, if a monster equipped to this card battles, you can send 1 monster from your extra deck to the graveyard. Now, the main combo with this, there's a whole bunch of funny ones you can do, but the one that most people were using is you could send Elder Entity Natis to your graveyard and then instantly blow up a card. That was actually pretty cool, and it gave this archetype sort of a controlling aspect, and that's really all they got. I can briefly shout out that they did get Cyber Darkness Dragon. This card wasn't that important. It was kind of way too difficult to summon, and also you couldn't summon it with Cyberdark Impact, which is like the main fusion spell of this archetype, so that card didn't really help out too much. But what we have here is 1 okay field spell and 2 pretty good level 3 dragons. What's the problem? Why didn't these cards top anything? Why weren't these cards experimented with much past their initial release? Well, there's 2 main issues. The first issue is that this deck was extremely linear. I mean, you pretty much know what you're doing every single turn, and while you want some sort of consistency as far as every game you want to be doing the same things, this one was so obvious. There was almost no opportunity for you to outplay your opponent because they knew that every turn all you were doing was normal summoning a Cyberdark and then equipping a guy, and that was so easily disruptible that your opponent really didn't have a hard time actually dealing with your cards. There certainly were some crazier combos in this deck, some cool interactions. I saw some people splashing these in Necros decks in the OCG. That's kind of neat, but in general, the actual Cyberdark deck was fairly linear, which made it really difficult to actually outplay your opponents and beat them with sort of complicated plays that they might have not heard of. And I think one of the biggest selling points of a lot of rogue decks is simply that your opponent doesn't know what you're doing, so they can't play around your cards. But when your deck is this linear, it makes it pretty easy to play around your cards and pretty easy to know what you're accomplishing or trying to accomplish, which means that you sort of lose that rogue deck edge that a lot of other rogue strategies have. But that's not the biggest issue. That was just one of the issues. The second issue, and what I believe is the main reason these cards were not successful in a competitive sense, you still have to play the original Cyberdarks, and oh my gosh, are they terrible. I mean, really, Cyberdark Keel, Cyberdark Horn, and Cyberdark Edge, they're horrible. I mean, even with these cards, even with all the support, even with giving them the non-targeting and non-destruction add-on when you equip them with these cards, they're still so bad. I mean, they actually don't do anything, and that is super disappointing, because that means that you're basically playing, if you're playing 9 copies of them total, because there's 3 different ones, you're basically playing 9 Garnets, and the worst hands in the Cyberdark deck were with all Cyberdark monsters, specifically when you drew all of the level 4 monsters, or even just a couple of them, and that's not good. A lot of times when you think of the top decks, they should be able to play out of hands when they have all archetype cards in their hands. I mean, think of decks like Dragon Rulers. If you drew 5 Dragon Rulers, maybe it wasn't as ridiculous as drawing cards like Super Rejuvenation or Hand Traps, but it was still very playable, and you can make a pretty insane board. If you think of like Burning Abyss when they were at their prime, drawing 5 Burning Abyss monsters was perfectly fine. When you look at Cyberdarks, and when you look at a lot of rogue strategies, one of the main issues is that they have to draw non-archetype cards to actually make an impact, and that was definitely the case with Cyberdarks. Yeah, you had cool cards like Black Salvo, one of my favorite sort of tuner monsters that revives a guy, and you could make a slick level 7 synchro monster, but that wasn't good enough to make this deck good. And even though you could draw some combos where you had Brilliant Fusion in your hand and just go off on your opponent, if your whole deck that plays Brilliant Fusion has to draw Brilliant Fusion to win, that makes it kind of rough, because there's going to be a lot of games where you don't draw it. So basically, these new Cyberdark cards, while they're not terrible, they just weren't quite good enough to sort of offset how bad the original Cyberdark monsters are, and that kind of leaves us in a weird spot. I mean, yes, the deck is a lot better than it used to be, but it still saw about the same amount of play as the original strategy, which means that I think in some ways the legacy support actually did fail in making this deck better. Even though this deck is technically better on paper, it didn't see any more play than the original, so did Konami really do their job with this legacy support? I think that's up in the air, but in my opinion, no, it did not do its job. If we compare it once again to Blades Accelerator Reload, that made a whole bunch of unplayable cards and an unplayable archetype actually a decent rogue contender, and that was only 1 new card that they gave them, and this gave them 4 new cards if we're counting the fusion monster, and it still didn't do enough. But anyway, let me know in the comments what you guys think about these Cyberdark cards. Did I overanalyze them too much? Are they actually pretty good? Please let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you guys later. Goodbye.